Mike was in a lot of trouble, man, and he had a publicist named Ramon Bain. And me and Mike was cool over the years. I always hung out with him and talked with him, and like, I was the only one that, and he said, Steve, I didn't do this, man. I just believed him.
For nearly 20 years, Steve Harvey has held on to a secret about Michael Jackson that could change everything the world thinks it knows. What does it mean when one of the most famous entertainers on earth breaks down behind closed doors and confides in a longtime friend about his darkest struggles? This isn't another claim or rumor. It's a heartfelt testimony from a man who saw Michael Jackson beyond the headlines and tabloid attacks, a story of loneliness, betrayal, and a fight for truth that only now, at age 69, Steve feels ready to share. The moment Steve witnessed Michael break. Steve Harvey kept a secret for nearly 2 decades, one so profound it challenges how we think about Michael Jackson. He was there on one of the darkest nights in Michael's life, when the man who once filled stadiums with roaring crowds was reduced to a broken figure. Steve described it as the moment Michael completely broke, a shattering of the illusion the world had long clung to. It was a version of Michael nobody else saw. Vulnerable, shaken, his hands trembling so much he could barely hold a cup of coffee. That image alone contradicts the unstoppable king of pop everyone thought they knew. What happened that night went far beyond celebrity troubles or tabloid drama. Michael called Steve in a panic, his voice cracking under the weight of betrayal and devastation. This was a man who trusted others, but had been deceived when he least expected it. Steve heard Michael say words he'd never shared publicly. A confession, carrying the pain of isolation and the crushing burden of false accusations. It was a truth hidden behind countless headlines, documentaries, and public judgments that had rewritten history. Steve recalls trying to find words to comfort a friend who seemed utterly lost. Despite being known for his humor and sharp wit, that evening offered no punchlines or quick fixes. The rawness of Michael's despair was too real. He wasn't angry or defensive at first. He was resigned and heartbroken by the system closing in on him. In those moments, Steve realized he was witnessing something far deeper than the public controversy, the personal cost of relentless scrutiny and misunderstanding. This moment also set the tone for everything Steve would carry in silence. While Michael's life was dissected on TV and in print, Steve held a private knowledge few shared and even fewer understood. There was a puzzled loneliness in Michael's voice, a question he repeated often. Why did the world hate him so much? It was a question that cut to the core of Steve's own reflections on fame, friendship, and justice. And it was a question that foreshadowed difficult revelations still to come. The significance of that night lies not just in Michael's pain, but in the unspoken pledge Steve made afterward, to be the guardian of a truth the world wasn't ready for. For years, he wrestled with the decision to keep this secret, quietly watching as the public narrative grew harsher and more unforgiving. The silence wasn't just about Michael. It was about protecting a friendship and preserving something profoundly human amid global spectacle. Yet, despite his silence, Steve always knew that one day he might have to speak out. That day would come not from legal battles or media coverage, but from a simple question posed by someone closest to him, a child asking about Michael's character. That innocent inquiry cracked open years of silence, forcing Steve to reconsider what it meant to stay quiet. The weight of the secret became unbearable when it risked being lost to a new generation shaped only by hearsay. Steve's revelation is more than a personal story. It is a challenge to the stories told about Michael Jackson for decades. It demands attention, not because it fits neatly into what the world expects, but because it complicates the narrative. The truth Steve holds isn't comfortable or convenient. It questions how fame, race, and power intersect with public perception and justice. And it demands that we look closer than the headlines. Even as the memory of that night lingered, the story of how Steve and Michael first connected years earlier reveals the roots of a complex friendship few ever saw. First meeting and their unlikely friendship. Most people don't realize that Steve Harvey and Michael Jackson first met in 1993, a moment that feels like a collision between two worlds. Steve was a comedian still grinding, doing stand-up shows and trying to build his name on the Apollo Theater stage in Harlem. Meanwhile, Michael was already a global icon, the biggest entertainer on the planet, returning to the stage of his childhood to honor Black excellence. It was a night charged with significance, though neither could have predicted how their paths would intertwine from there. Steve remembers feeling nervous, almost starstruck, because Michael Jackson wasn't just famous. He was mythical. Approaching Michael felt like stepping into a different reality. But what surprised Steve most was how Michael approached him first. Without bodyguards or handlers, just the man himself. Dressed in a red jacket adorned with gold braiding, Michael's presence was commanding, but also gentle. "You're Steve Harvey," he said softly. "I've seen your work. You're funny, but you're also real. That's rare." That moment stunned Steve. Here was a comedian still paying his dues, recognized and valued by the world's most famous entertainer. Even more striking was Michael's interest in Steve's background, his childhood, his struggles growing up in Cleveland, sleeping in his car as he chased his dream. Michael's eyes changed during that conversation, becoming intense and piercing. "You would understand struggle," he said. "Real struggle, not the kind people perform for sympathy." The deep conversation between them lasted 20 minutes, which explored three main topics: the experience of being Black in entertainment, the need to meet community expectations, and the negative impact of success. Michael told Steve that people would attempt to ruin him once he achieved greater success. The message was clear: survive by staying true to yourself, no matter the pressure to conform or break. Steve thought Michael wanted to discuss philosophy when he later heard about Michael's explanation. Michael used his own experiences to provide Steve with a warning about the dangers of success. Their relationship progressed to a point where they became more than acquaintances, but less than close friends. Michael would call Steve late at night to discuss his life experiences, which included grocery shopping and family arguments, and all the small details that Michael never experienced. Steve found these calls surreal. The man who holds the title of most famous person worldwide asked questions about ordinary life, which he examined like a scientist who studies rare specimens. The moment gave others a rare chance to see Michael, who normally wanted to live like all the other people. The conversations showed Michael's deep loneliness, which he experienced throughout his life. He spent his life around people, yet he remained completely alienated from others. Everybody around him, including those who claimed to love him, wanted to take advantage of him. He showed himself to the public through his unique public persona, which people saw at his public appearances. Steve recognized that Michael existed in two opposite states because he achieved great fame, yet experienced deep loneliness. With a friendship rooted in struggle and genuine curiosity, the loneliness Michael endured became impossible to ignore. Loneliness behind fame's curtain. Despite his immense success, Michael Jackson lived in a cage of solitude few could imagine. Steve Harvey describes a loneliness so profound it was almost palpable during their late-night conversations. Michael was constantly surrounded by managers, assistants, employees, and fans, yet he had no real connection with anyone. Everyone around him had agendas. Genuine love and friendship were scarce commodities. This deep isolation was a harsh reality beneath the glittering surface. Michael lived a life where the simplest acts, like going to a barber shop or arguing with his wife over bills, fascinated him. To him, those normal human experiences were foreign and precious because he'd never had them. Steve said Michael asked about everyday things with a curiosity that was almost childlike. It was as if Michael was trying to understand a life he was born to perform, but never fully live. That yearning for normalcy underscored his profound alienation from the world. The artist experienced both emotional and spiritual isolation. Michael discussed God and love and redemption more than any other person Steve had met, yet he admitted that he no longer believed these possibilities applied to him. The man used his public behavior as a disguise to find inner peace and build social connections. Steve saw Michael reveal his true self because media coverage missed his inner struggle for connection, which he experienced as a deeply emotional person who wanted to belong. Fame brought him intense pressure, which transformed into paranoia that created deeper gaps between him and others. Michael and Lisa Marie Presley's 1995 marriage received public doubt, which tabloids declared as a publicity stunt. Michael fought internal battles about his real self and how people viewed him when he was not visible to the world. Steve recalls that Michael reached a point of exhaustion because people failed to understand him. Michael's actions received evaluation based on what other people made about him. Michael existed within a public prison, which confined him with its developed stories about him. Michael had lost his identity as a man because people viewed him as a cultural symbol and an exaggerated representation of himself. The world viewed him without his human qualities. Steve felt sorrow because the outstanding celebrity had become a captive of a community that refused to recognize anything beyond its existing beliefs, which matched Michael's personal struggles throughout his entire life. When the media and public opinion would shatter what little peace he had left, leading to a fracture that few witnessed, but Steve could never forget. The 2003 Bashir documentary Fallout. In February 2003, the release of Martin Bashir's documentary Living with Michael Jackson marked a turning point that changed everything for Michael. What was meant to be his chance to control the narrative became a catalyst for overwhelming public scrutiny and betrayal. Steve Harvey recalls watching the broadcast at home, along with millions around the world. But unlike most viewers, his phone rang before the documentary even ended. It was Michael, crying. The vulnerability in Michael's voice was unlike anything Steve had ever heard from the man who normally commanded global stages. Michael told Steve how deeply betrayed he felt by Bashir, a journalist he trusted enough to let into his home and life for 8 months. Instead of capturing the truth, Bashir's edited footage painted Michael as delusional and dangerous, twisting intimate moments into incriminating scenes. The segment showing Michael holding hands with a young cancer patient, while explained by Michael as a gesture of comfort, was framed with insinuation and judgment, sparking outrage worldwide. Steve remembers Michael saying, "They tricked me," over and over, revealing not anger, but profound devastation. Within weeks, the fallout escalated when the Arvizo family, the same family Michael had helped during their son's illness, came forward with allegations that ignited a fierce legal battle. The Santa Barbara District Attorney, Tom Snedden, who had previously failed to prosecute Michael in 1993, launched an aggressive pursuit this time. Steve saw firsthand how this legal assault was more than a search for justice. It felt like a determined effort to destroy a man. The raid on Neverland Ranch by 70 police officers was broadcast globally, amplifying Michael's humiliation. Michael trusted Steve because he had never bowed to public pressure or flattered him insincerely. Steve was one of the few people granted private visits during this dark time, and what he witnessed was haunting. Neverland, once a vibrant sanctuary filled with laughter and life, felt like a ghost town. Michael, gaunt and hollow-eyed, sat among piles of legal documents, his hands shaking so severely he couldn't hold a coffee cup steady. This was a man dismantled by relentless attacks, not just on his reputation, but on his very spirit. You should write your text with simpler sentence structure because readers find your text more understandable at that level. Michael's son entered the room during a visit and asked his father about why television people made negative statements about his father. Steve observed Michael's emotional breakdown while he spoke softly to Michael about his anxiety and his inability to understand things which he feared. Michael experienced a deep personal strength, which he maintained throughout his battle against Michael's life challenges and his desire to protect his children's future. Steve shared with Michael that the attacks against him involved more than allegations because they centered on different power dynamics, which involved both race and domination. He said, "They want to destroy me instead of seeking justice for me." Michael believed that his success and his wealth and his refusal to conform to others' expectations made him a target. Steve acknowledges that some dismissed this as paranoia, but what he witnessed proved otherwise. Michael's warnings became true when these forces sought to destroy him because they attacked both his career and his fundamental identity. Steve observed Michael's determination to fight back against his legal troubles while the world went through its chaotic period. He showed signs of physical exhaustion, but he refused to admit defeat to complete hopelessness. The man who faced public judgment through their unfair treatment to him displayed a remarkable ability to endure hardships. Steve considered this period to be a public trial, which showed people what occurs when relentless persecution leads to the complete dehumanization of others. Even as the courtroom doors opened for what became a 5-month judicial spectacle, the question of innocence versus destruction loomed larger than ever. The legal battles and public perception. The trial that began in January 2005 quickly turned into a media circus rivaling the infamous O.J. Simpson case. Michael Jackson had to navigate a gauntlet of reporters, protesters, and hopeful fans every single day just to step into the courthouse. His every move was dissected and broadcast, his character picked apart in front of the world. For Steve Harvey, watching this unfold was both surreal and painful, because he knew the truth from his conversations with Michael and the flaws of the prosecution. Michael specifically asked Steve not to attend the trial, wanting to shield him from the chaos. It was a protective gesture that baffled Steve, given the circumstances Michael was facing. But that was Michael's nature. Even in catastrophe, he was thinking of others before himself. Instead, Steve kept close by, following the court transcripts, watching news coverage, and talking to the legal team. What he saw was a prosecution struggling to assemble a credible case. Key witnesses contradicted themselves under pressure, and the credibility of the accuser's family unraveled throughout the proceedings. There was no physical evidence linking Michael to any wrongdoing, only statements clouded by inconsistency and questionable motives. Despite this, the narrative spun by the media was overwhelmingly against him. Headlines focused on Michael's eccentricities, including incidents like showing up late to court in pajamas because of a back injury, feeding a distorted image of instability. Steve vividly recalls one night during the trial when he called Michael and asked him directly, "Did you do any of what they're saying?" The silence on the other end was long and heavy, finally broken by a quiet but firm denial. Michael told him, "I have never harmed a child. Not in thought, not in word, not in deed. I would rather die than hurt a child." Steve believed him, not blindly, but because years of witnessing Michael with children showed him the truth of a gentle man trying to reclaim innocence. The verdict on June 13, 2005, returned not guilty on all 14 counts, a legal exoneration that should have brought relief. Yet Steve saw only devastation in Michael afterward. "We won," Michael said softly, "but I lost everything anyway." The courtroom victory couldn't undo the damage done by years of accusation, media frenzy, and personal loss. For Michael, innocence did not restore peace. It marked a hollow victory in a war that had already taken a heavy toll. Steve understood then that the fight was never truly about guilt or innocence. It was about narrative control, racial dynamics, and the cost of defying a media machine eager to confirm preconceptions. Michael's refusal to conform was seen as arrogance. His vulnerability was painted as weakness. Steve witnessed firsthand how the court of public opinion can override legal judgment and ruin a person's life, regardless of the facts. Yet, the story was far from over. The real revelations came after the courtroom drama, in private moments where Michael confided the heartache hiding behind the headlines. Michael's private confession to Steve. 3 months after the trial, Michael Jackson left the United States, seeking refuge from the storm that had overtaken his life. He couldn't stay at Neverland Ranch any longer. The place meant to be his sanctuary now symbolized his public crucifixion. He traveled to Bahrain, then Ireland, chasing peace and anonymity. But before he departed, he met with Steve Harvey one last time in a quiet, nondescript hotel room in Los Angeles. Away from cameras and public scrutiny, Michael finally opened up in ways he never had before. In that intimate meeting, Michael revealed burdens and memories he had kept buried for decades. He spoke of his childhood, marked by Joe Jackson's harsh discipline and abuse, the pressure to perform even when he was sick, and the torment of watching his father mistreat his brothers. Michael described the loneliness of being the most famous child in the world, with no friends his own age and constant mobbing whenever he stepped outside. Steve recalls the heartbreak in Michael's voice when he said, "I never had a childhood, Steve, never." Michael explained how he tried to create the childhood he missed by building Neverland, his attempt to reclaim innocence and joy. Yet that very sanctuary was weaponized against him, a place used to fuel public speculation and legal battles. He also confessed why he settled the 1993 civil suit despite his attorney's advice. It was exhaustion, pain, and the inability to endure a trial while preparing for a demanding tour. Settling, he said, was the biggest mistake of his life because it made him look guilty to the world, even though he was innocent. What followed were revelations few were prepared to hear. Michael told Steve that the allegations were never really about the claims themselves. "They targeted me because I bought the Beatles catalog," he said, "because I owned my masters, because I was a black man with more power and wealth than they were comfortable with." The accusations were the weapon. The real goal was to break him, bankrupt him, and steal back what he had earned through decades of hard work. Steve stopped to think about how challenging it proved to understand the truth, because people would too easily dismiss it as a conspiracy theory. Michael showed facts, which proved his statements because he lost all his music rights and his national reputation, despite winning his court case. Tom Sneddon, who prosecuted the case against Michael, never showed any remorse or recognition of Michael's possible innocence. The experience of betrayal created deep emotional wounds, which Michael carried throughout his final years. Michael confided that he felt he wasn't going to survive, not just his career, but himself. "I feel it," he told Steve. "They've taken too much, and I don't know how to get it back." The efforts to rebuild his life proved useless because people already considered him guilty after the trial result. He thought that suspicion would stay with him forever because people would never stop discussing his character. He had reached his limit because constant battling had drained him completely. Their farewell reached its final moments through deep emotional and serious solemnity. Steve sensed that Michael would not return after their extended hug because they developed a special bond. Michael thanked Steve for believing in him, for seeing him as a person and not a headline. He vanished into a completely different reality which he had never experienced before. The moment established the conclusion of a historical period which existed between friendship and authentic existence, yet it remained troubled by suffering. The gravity of Michael's private revelations would weigh heavily on Steve for years, shaping the silence he kept, but a question from innocence would eventually break it. The cost of silence and why Steve spoke now. For nearly 20 years, Steve Harvey held back from speaking about what he knew, carrying Michael's truth in silence amid continuing controversy. Despite friends urging him to comment and fans demanding his perspective, especially after the 2019 HBO documentary Leaving Neverland reignited allegations, Steve stayed quiet. He made a promise to himself that he wouldn't speak until he was ready to tell the whole truth, not just the fragments people wanted to hear. For a long time, he wasn't ready. Steve explains that the silence was born of anger, grief, and the complexity of what he'd witnessed. He needed time to process years of betrayal, legal battles, and media distortions surrounding his friend. Speaking out too soon risked reopening wounds and exposing himself to backlash. The story wasn't simple. It was tangled with race, justice, public perception, and deep personal pain. What finally compelled Steve to break that silence wasn't the media, the fans, or even the documentaries. It was a question from an innocent source, his 12-year-old granddaughter. Coming home from school, she asked, "Grandpa Steve, was Michael Jackson a bad man? That simple, heartbreaking question shattered the barrier Steve had maintained. It made him realize that a whole generation was growing up believing lies, not interpretations or perspectives, but outright falsehoods. Steve understood then that staying silent meant allowing those lies to flourish unchallenged. He could no longer watch as Michael's legacy was distorted and destroyed by narratives from people who never knew him, never sat with him, and never heard his pain firsthand. This burden became heavier than any personal fear Steve had about speaking out. It was a call to action that he could not ignore. He also knew the risks involved. Steve anticipated the backlash, the accusations of defending a predator or being naive and complicit. He was aware that many would reject anything that contradicted their preconceived beliefs about Michael Jackson. Yet Steve was resolute. He said he would rather be called naive for believing in an innocent man than be complicit in the destruction of his legacy by remaining silent. This decision was not just about defending Michael, but about honoring a deeper legacy. Steve wanted to remind the world that Michael was more than the allegations and headlines. He was a mirror reflecting society's values and flaws: love, innocence, generosity, artistry. Society destroyed him for embodying those qualities because, deep down, people often prefer cynicism and scandal over truth. Steve also emphasized Michael's humanitarian contributions, which the media has largely ignored, donating over $300 million to charity, supporting 39 organizations, building hospitals, funding scholarships, and helping children worldwide. This decision marks the end of silence and the beginning of a pledge to honor the man behind the music and headlines. Michael's legacy beyond controversy. Michael Jackson's legacy goes far beyond the scandals and headlines that dominated his later years. Steve Harvey emphasizes that Michael was more than the allegations or the media's caricature. He was a man who reflected society's highest ideals and deepest contradictions. Michael embodied love, innocence, generosity, and extraordinary artistry, qualities that many in society claimed to value but ultimately rejected in him. Steve argues that society destroyed Michael not because of who he was, but because those ideals challenged what people were comfortable accepting. One of the most overlooked parts of Michael's story is his humanitarian work. Throughout his lifetime, he donated over $300 million to charity, supporting 39 different organizations, a Guinness World Record for the most charities supported by a pop star. He built hospitals, funded scholarships, and helped sick children worldwide. Despite these massive contributions, Steve points out that few headlines celebrate this side of Michael Jackson, showing the imbalance in how his life was portrayed versus the truth. Steve also calls out the media for profiting off the very legacy they helped destroy. Many documentaries, biopics, and streaming revenues now benefit people who never believed in Michael or defended him during his darkest moments. This paradox troubles Steve deeply because it highlights how commercial interests can overshadow justice and truth. The story of Michael Jackson is being told without honoring the man himself, turning his life into a commodity rather than a complex human narrative. This legacy is linked to a broader societal issue: the systematic breakdown of Black excellence and influence. Steve draws parallels between Michael's destruction and similar patterns faced by figures like Jack Johnson, Muhammad Ali, Prince, and others who dared to challenge established power structures. The goal, Steve explains, is always to remind those who rise too high of their place. The machinery of destruction targets those who refuse to stay confined to assigned roles, especially in the realm of race and power. Steve demonstrates strong disapproval about how journalism failed to cover the situation involving Michael. He asserts that the media performed character assassination instead of conducting journalism which turned Michael's kindness and unique traits and mild personality into proof of his wrongdoing. The headlines used Michael's soft voice and his rare conduct, and his passion for children, as tools for their attacks against him. Steve considers this behavior to create a hazardous situation that supports a system which treats allegations as proof of guilt, while people disregard important details and believe whatever the majority opinion states. Michael Jackson established himself as the first example of this contemporary cancellation movement, which forces public figures to maintain perfect standards or face complete rejection from society. Steve identifies Michael as the first victim to be destroyed completely by the unforgiving social environment, which he describes as patient zero because of its associations with his public image. The strategies that his opponents utilized against him now serve as standard practices to target numerous individuals, which reveals how contemporary public dialogue has become more harmful due to its loss of detailed analysis and impartiality. Steve accepts all aspects of Michael's personality because he views Michael as an exceptional person who possessed both strengths and weaknesses. He wants Michael's real story to be told, one that includes pain and imperfection, but also grace and resilience. For Steve, legacy is not just what is left behind, but what people choose to remember. And he chooses to remember his friend as he truly was.